Hey, you guys, it's Kim. If you're new to the Control Variable, welcome. And if you listened to our show last winter, welcome back. I'm really excited to be here with you guys today. But I have to admit, I'm also kind of nervous. And last night, thinking about doing the show today, I was really nervous. I kind of had a freak out. So there's this thing I do sometimes when I'm freaking out. I go watch this old TV show called Twin Peaks. It's a murder mystery from the late 80s, made by the director David Lynch. It's amazing. Easily my favorite TV show of all time. You don't want to know how many times I've seen it. Anyway, Twin Peaks is dark and weird and smart and sexy and scary and oddly sweet and exuberant and kind of wholesome all at the same time. In other words, it's a very American show. But Twin Peaks is also set in an America that's almost 35 years old at this point. An America that seemed a lot simpler, even when people were getting murdered. The show soothes me in this weird way. Lets me escape reality for a while, which is something I think we all need these days at times. So that's what I did last night when I was scared. I went for a run, then I watched Twin Peaks. And on this episode of Twin Peaks, there's a teenager named Donna, whose best friend has just been murdered. At the same time, Donna's falling in love with this guy she really should not be falling in love with. And at a certain point, Donna says to her mom, "I feel like I'm living the most beautiful dream and the most terrible nightmare all at once." I heard her say that and I thought, that is exactly what my life feels like right now. I spent most of 2021 investigating American propaganda and the role it played in the attack on our Capitol on January 6th. And I turned it into a 5-episode podcast called The Control Variable. And the show was a hit. People really liked it. Enough that my bosses at Atomic Whale Studios said, "Keep it going, Kim. Make the Control Variable weekly. Keep talking about this amazing, screwed up, terribly divided country of ours. And the propaganda. The stories and myths that brought us to this dangerous place." So I hope you'll come find us on Instagram and Facebook. Tell us what you think about the show, how you're doing in these strange times of ours. Ask us questions, give us suggestions about who you think we should have on. Help us get a grip on this wild American future we're facing together. Help us think about how we might build a better world. And look, when I say better, I don't mean better in a joyless, self-righteous, drop and give me 200 push-ups kind of way. I mean better as in awesome. Better as in delicious and nutritious. Because honestly, despite everything that's going on right now, and my need to mainline Twin Peaks from time to time, I'm actually hopeful. The fact that I get to talk to you guys about this stuff honestly, about what's going on here in America, and interview people who have good ideas about what we might do about it, that makes me okay. It's kind of like the dragon in fairy tales. You know how you have to get right up close to it, hold that scaly bastard right up to the light and see it for what it is before you can figure out what to do about it? That's what we're going to do in the Control Variable from here on out. We're going to look at the dragons. We're going to have in-depth conversations with people from all over America and all across the political spectrum. People who are trying to figure out how to take those dragons on and solve some of the biggest challenges we're facing, from the deep-seated problems embedded in our country's founding stories, to the divisive nature of our two-party system, to the question of how to live joyfully and responsibly on our incredible, rapidly melting planet. Because I want to know how to live in this weird new world of ours. I want to look our dragons straight in the eye and find the people who can help us get them in hand. Okay? You guys ready? From Atomic Whale Studios, this is The Control Variable. I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. On today's show, we're going to talk about a question that came up a lot while I was investigating the attack on the Capitol. It's this. Exactly how much of a role does the American media play in our current political divide? How responsible are the headlines we read for all the hate we Americans seem to feel for each other these days? Here to talk to us is one of my favorite guests, the coolest, funniest media and propaganda expert you will ever meet, Dr. Sam Woolley. Sam is an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin. And he's the project director of the Propaganda Research Lab at the Center for Media Engagement at UT. He's also the founder of the Digital Intelligence Lab at the Institute for the Future, and the author of The Reality Game, and the upcoming book, Manufacturing Consensus. Sam lives with his wife, also named Sam, and their new baby Penny in Austin. Here's why I love talking to Sam. First, he's a lot smarter than I am. Second, he's not afraid to stare down even the hairiest, gnarliest media and propaganda problems worth dealing with in America right now. Thirdly, he's got good ideas about how we can fix them. And finally, he's a blast to talk to. So without further ado, here's my chat with the wonderful Sam Wooley. Before we head down the dark alley of American media and propaganda, tell me what's exciting you these days, Sam? Like what's giving you joy?
That is a really, really good question. Well, first of all, my baby, Penny, a little boy, he's giving me a lot of joy, changing the way I see the world, making me pivot more to solutions to all the problems we're going to talk about today. And so that's kind of nice, because for a very long time I've been in this kind of brutal space, having to think about disinformation and all the informational problems that exist that are affecting our democracy. And so it's nice to have him and think, okay, what do we do to make this thing better? So we can definitely talk about that a bit today.
Awesome. Tell me what's the last awesome thing that Penn did?
Yesterday I got home from work and he does a nanny share with another little boy named Nathan. And I came outside and they were both on a splash pad. Penny's 6 months old and Nathan's 9 months old. And they were having a total blast and it was hilarious.
What's a splash pad?
It's like a little flat thing that shoots up water, and the babies were on it and they were playing with these little duckies and they were both laughing a lot and they were both wearing their little swim diapers, which just looked like Speedos. And it was just it kind of looks like two little old men playing on on this splash pad thing with their nanny. And it was hilarious.
That's so cute. We got to remember this stuff, right? Because there's a lot of darkness in the world these days.
I know. I'm trying to stay optimistic. And I will say, as we talk through all this stuff, I am kind of like a cautious optimist in this space, even though a lot of what we're going to talk about today is scary and needs dealing with. There's still a lot of reasons for hope.
I'm really glad to hear that. And I'm going to want to hear every single one of those reasons from you.
I'll come up with a bullet pointed list. Yeah.
When did you become fascinated by the media and how did you decide to specialize in the American media and propaganda?
I took a bunch of communication and media classes when I was an undergraduate in the early 2000s. And I found that stuff fascinating then. Mostly I was interested in media ownership. No surprise there, given what we're going to talk about today. And I was interested in sort of how conglomerates controlled the media space. I was young and I was very self-righteous about this kind of stuff and talked a lot about it to my friends. It wasn't until I went and did a master's degree at the Claremont colleges after undergrad, and I got interested in Saul Alinsky and labor organizing and very interested in politics and media theory. And so I kind of became a wonk like that. But it wasn't until 2013 that I really started focusing upon the ways that social media was being used both as a tool for democratic organizing during Occupy and the Arab Spring, and also for control. So I'd been dabbling in analysis of the Arab Spring and Occupy and thinking, social media, we're all talking about it as this tool that's going to be used to really benefit democracy around the world. But I had this strange inkling at the time, from a lot of the traffic I was seeing online, that there was also a lot of bad stuff going on. And it wasn't really being highlighted. Specifically, what I was interested in is the way that powerful political actors and also all sorts of extremist groups and frankly, regular people too, were leveraging things like bots, so automated profiles online, sock puppets, so fake profiles run by people, how they were using these things to both spread false content, to amplify their own voices while suppressing other voices through spam and noise and attacks. We still have a long way to go, especially in other languages and other countries and on non-mainstream platforms, but it has gotten better. I will say that.
Okay, so Sam, as you know, I was struck during my investigation into January 6th and the attack on the Capitol by the role that both sides of the American media seems to play in our political divide. Before I started doing the investigation on the control variable, it was very obvious that the conservative media was doing that. So, for example, Fox News and One American News Network, that seemed very obvious examples of very sensationalized and very binary storytelling, and also often seemingly incorrect. But then the farther I looked into it, the more I realized that basically a lot of liberal news sources or quote mainstream news sources also have this tendency to highlight conflict and amplify conflict. And even though I trust, as a journalist myself, I know what goes into fact checking and I trust the mainstream media in terms of its fact checking, I cannot help but notice the dramatization that goes on in the storytelling and believe that that's a sincere part of this problem as well. So I just wondered what you thought about that.
There's no doubt that the American media system, the United States media system, is fraught with conflict-oriented, fear-mongering frames, right? We talk in journalism studies, we talk about framing, right? And so how the story is positioned by the journalist matters a lot. It can still contain facts. It can still contain quote unquote truth. But if they choose to focus upon the conflict in the story, or if they choose to focus upon one aspect of it instead of painting a more well-rounded picture, it can result in this kind of emotionally charged journalism that we know very well today. This kind of journalism has existed in the United States for a really long time, right? Like most people in high school encountered the term yellow journalism, which is a term from the late 1800s when we had the Hearsts and Pulitzers of the world competing with one another to put out sensational news in a very, very similar vein. The thing that's changed today, however, is the fact that a lot of these news media organizations are operating on a 24-hour news cycle. They're very caught up with the concept of the sound bite. And most people that intake news get it online. And so they only tend to read like either the headline or a few paragraphs of the article.
Right.
And so the news media today are very focused on catching attention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing I think that is really important to mention is there is asymmetric polarization in the American media as far as the research shows. What do I mean by that fancy term? So what I mean is that there's a book out there called Network Propaganda, which is a great analysis of the American media system by Yochai Benkler and his colleagues. And what they found is that in the American media on the left and media in the center that are ranked as either center or left by news media indexes tend to report on the same stories. And not only do they tend to report on the same stories, they tend to report on the same stories in the same way most of the time. There's not a lot of divergence from the narratives that get told. So they do adhere to a specific ethical code. They do follow the guidelines of the various American journalism institutions that dictate these things. Given all of this, we know that the center and the left tend to, I wouldn't say strictly, but I'd say more strictly adhere to those codes of ethics and tell the same sorts of stories. The thing is, the right-wing media in the United States, the Fox News of the world, then the Breitbarts, the One American News Networks, et cetera, are far more polarized and tell a completely different set of stories in a different set of ways most of the time when it comes to breaking news. So if you look at the media online and off, the framing, not only the framing, but also the content is very different. So if you go to CNN, if you go to MSNBC, if you go to Huffington Post, if you go to the Associated Press, you're going to see the similar headlines on those websites. If you go to Fox News, all bets tend to be kind of off. You might see something completely different covered on Fox News, especially, say, for instance, if it's Jan 6th that's being covered. Like, they're going to cover it totally differently. They might not cover it.
Let's make an illustration of this. Like, if you can, give me an example of the way that, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post would cover a story and put on its front page versus what One American News Network would, how they would cover the same event, and also what else might surround it.
So the Uvalde shootings recently, the really tragic events in Uvalde, center and left-leaning news organizations would cover it, talking about how many people died, the specifications of the shooting, what local leaders are saying, what experts say, et cetera. When you go to the One American News Network, you go to these other places, you would see content about how the left are going to use it as a means to ban guns. You would see other kinds of fear-mongering associated with Second Amendment rights. You would see discussion about mental health rather than discussion of the specifications of what actually happened.
How responsible do you think the media is for our country's current divide?
If we look at statistics from organizations like Pew, we know that distrust in the American media has been growing with rapidity over the last couple of decades, and that coincides, say, for instance, with the rise of the internet. And so you can't really separate those two things. That being said, distrust in the American media has always been there. And there have always been sensational media practices in the United States. It's just that the internet has allowed for the amplification of those same practices and built a many-to-many system where almost anyone can become a propagandist in some way, shape, or form, in the same way that anyone can, quote unquote, become a journalist. And so yeah, our information system has become very noisy, and people have struggled to adapt. And by people, I mean people in the media.
Yeah. Okay. So the media has obviously become very focused on profit. And I want to go back to a time when it wasn't necessarily going to be that way, which you've told me about. And I want you to tell it here because I think it's really important.
In the late 1800s, Herman and Chomsky do a really great job of outlining this in Manufacturing Consent, which is one of the seminal books in propaganda. But what they talk about is the fact that in the late 1800s, there was a simultaneous rise of more communal union presses, trade union presses, that were built to serve the people, and a concurrent rise of commercial presses that were driven by the prerogative of advertising. The long story short there is that the commercial presses were quickly able to outstrip and buy out and cause the closure of the trade union presses because they had so much corporate backing. The trade-off there was that they kind of sold themselves to the advertisers who were supporting them. And so we've had a long history in this country of money in the press. And what happens when money is involved in the press is that the powerful are able in some way, shape, or form to dictate what gets published and how. And so that's why Herman and Chomsky talk about manufacturing consent. They talk about this idea that our media system is owned, something like 90% of the news media organizations in the United States are owned by 6 or 7 companies.
Right.
And that their practices are dictated by advertising, but also the way that ownership means that the kind of reporting that gets done is heavily edited and redacted in the favor of the people who own the media.
And would you say that that's true across the board, just more true in the conservative media?
Without a doubt, it's more true on the far right in particular. And when you get into the far left, it's true as well. Let's be honest. If you look at some far left media organizations, that they are pretty well driven by the ownership's prerogatives or the editorial prerogatives. But even in sort of the middle space of the American media, there is a large-scale attempt to control. And that's what's discussed in network propaganda. I discuss it quite a lot in my new book, which is called Manufacturing Consensus, as you said earlier, which is a riff on Herman and Chomsky. But yeah, most media organizations have a series of filters through which a news story has to pass in order to get published. And unfortunately, if that media organization is owned by an individual who also owns, this is totally hypothetical, an airline, or who also owns nuclear reactors, then it's quite unlikely that a hypercritical story on those airlines or nuclear reactors is going to get published. That's the thesis of Herman and Chomsky. I think it bears out today in a big way. And the argument that I make in my new book is that social media companies have at least partially supplanted those broadcast companies that, we know, love, or hate in this control mechanism. So Facebook is run like a monarchy, kind of,
right,
with Mark Zuckerberg at the top, and until very recently, Sheryl Sandberg at the top.
Yep.
And if you talk to people at Facebook and do research on these kinds of things, you learn very quickly that decisions that they think are the most important are massively prioritized over what the researchers are telling them to do. So even though the researchers might know disinformation is a massive problem and it needs to be changed in XYZ way, if that does not align with people at the very top, that's not what happens. And it's a problem because it means that our media system and the media that we intake and the information that we get is less than quality.
Right. I mean, we talked about this at the end of my investigation, just in terms of the fact of the internet and the inherently sort of sensational nature of the internet has forced, if they want to compete, they have had to become even more conflict driven and more focused on just how to get eyeballs, as they say, right?
Of course, because they have to figure out how to get clicked on, because they're passing through the filter of social media. Social media has become an important filter, and Facebook and Twitter, according to organizations like Pew, are very popular spaces through which people get their news. And if that's the case, then algorithms on those sites dictate what kind of news people see, how they see it, when they see it, etc. And so news media organizations have had to figure out how to, quote unquote, hack that system or play in that system. And that means SEO, search engine optimization, figuring out how they can get their story to show up first on Google. But it also means, how the heck do we get our stuff to trend? How do we get it to go viral? And it has led to a lot of practices that are pretty dubious. One that really frustrates me is sensational headlines. So headlines that are either really sensational or they're really misleading. And this happens across the board on almost all news media websites. Like, I will see a headline and I'll be like, whoa, what? And I'll click on it. And it turns out that what they said in the headline does not have very much to do with it at all. Like, it tangentially does maybe, but it's like at the very end of the story. And so, that is a really frustrating practice that is used in order to get people to click on something. Everyone knows what clickbait is. There's oftentimes actually on media websites, there's articles that are like 10 ways to lose weight without dieting or exercising. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there is definitely an element of clickbait across other media sites here in the United States and around the world. But we've got to think about the qualities of propaganda over the last 50 years or 100 years even. And one of the qualities of propaganda, particularly in the last half a century, and particularly from the far right, but also the right in American politics, has been to attack institutions. Yes, it's bound up in this desire for small government, but the desire for small government doesn't mean no government. And the desire for small government doesn't mean the government's corrupt. That has changed in the right-wing narrative, particularly with Donald Trump, but also during the Bush administration and others, where they towed this line that resulted in institutions are corrupt, institutions are bad. We need to take all money out of institutions, whether it's medicine, academia, government, all of these things. And that has resulted really in a delegitimization of a lot of the things that we really have to depend upon, and a rise of conspiracy theory. And one of the things I say in the reality game is conspiracy theory is like getting off an exit too soon on the road to critical thinking. You think you're thinking in a way that involves research. You think you're thinking in a way that involves nuance and evidence, but actually you're being led down a path that exists absent empiricism. There's no verification. There's no observation. The scientific method is not there. And through that conspiracy theory being ironically institutionalized in a part of our politics, we've seen a huge degradation of the American psyche and of what we think is okay.
Yeah. And let me ask you a question. I mean, how much do you trust the American government at this point, honestly?
I trust the bureaucracy of the American government to do what it needs to do. I think that the bureaucracy of the American government is a bit of a juggernaut, and it continues despite anything almost. I think that what kept us afloat during the Trump administration was the bureaucracy. These people that work every day towards particular ends through the infrastructure that's been built over the course of numerous Republican and Democratic presidents.
And you would say, despite the corporate lobbies, despite the powers of corporate lobbies to influence what decisions actually get made?
I think that the bureaucracy has been able to continue and to achieve what it needs to achieve, despite that. Up until quite recently, lobbyists and lobbying and the introduction of the kind of money we see in politics now after Citizens United has changed the game in a big way. It's true. And it's a huge, 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 huge problem. Like, we cannot underscore enough the problem of dark money in politics, and the problem of dark money in propaganda campaigns and all of these sorts of things. Like, that lack of transparency is probably one of the single biggest cause of the problems that we see in politics in America today. So I'm glad you brought it up.
I mean, that's the thing I run my head up against all the time. It's just like, that's the piece that I don't really see a way around in terms of, it just seems the interests of corporations and the influence of corporations seems so entrenched in our systems.
It is. I read somewhere, there's some viral tweet recently. It's probably like a regurgitation of a tweet that was viral a while back, but it said something like, politicians should have to wear jackets that have patches of all their corporate sponsors on them the way that NASCAR drivers do. Which is really funny, right?
Yeah,
because
totally.
The thing is, most politicians take tons of money from corporations, and so they're beholden to them. Politics is a money game. The minute someone gets elected to the House of Representatives in a 2-year term, they start campaigning again for their next reelection. And because you now have to have millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in your campaign for the House, and even more if you're campaigning for the Senate or the presidency, you become beholden to the people that give you money. And there is a trend, which is quite nice, towards small donations from regular people. And oftentimes politicians are quite proud of that, but it's very hard to compete in the exact same way the union press had a hard time competing with the commercial press. It's hard for those people to compete with the people who are taking tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from corporations.
Yeah, and I would also say that, I mean, the extent to which tax loopholes, enable corporations to profit in a way that is just straight up greedy. I actually can't trust the government as long as that's true.
There's parts of the American political system that are broken. And the injection of the kind of money that we see in politics right now is a broken part of the American political system and has to be fixed in order for us to make headway.
So, Sam, what are we going to do about all this? Take me through it step by step. Let's bring the light.
There's a multi-tiered way of thinking about the solutions to this problem. And this is something I talk about a lot in the reality game and that I've been building out more in my recent work. And that is, there's no one law that will solve the problem. There's no one technology that will solve the problem. And so we have to think about this in three ways, right? And this is even generalization in itself, but we got to do something here, right? So we need educational fixes, we need policy-based fixes, and we need technological fixes. Part of the problem with the way that disinformation and misinformation have been presented in the popular media and the zeitgeist is they've been presented as a problem that exists with a purely technological solution. That's not true. Those are innately social problems first, then they're technological problems. And so, yes, it's true that social media causes amplification and is a huge part of the problem. But education and policy play much more of a role, I believe, than technology in solving our current crisis. So first, we have to create better media literacy campaigns and better informational literacy programs in our public schools. Our public school systems lack critical thinking programs. And this is tied to the implementation of programs that are test-based. The things like No Child Left Behind, which have really taken our educational system and turned it into something that is metrics driven, much like social media, rather than driven by teaching kids to think critically and ask the tough questions.
I was not that engaged of a student when I was in high school and even in college. Really, I sort of really snapped to attention in grad school. Before that, I just studied what I felt like studying. But I really, really was taught by the school that I went to how to think critically. And I feel like that was kind of the most essential tool I ever learned. I just think that the tendency, the ability to think critically and to just be willing to engage sincerely with questions instead of just receive information is just totally crucial.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, critical thinking, I would argue, is tied to the ability to build some of that curiosity into people who aren't innately curious. So you teach them how to think critically, and they're able to ask tough questions in a way that helps them to see where change might be made. And it gives them hope. But a lot of students that show up to college in America these days have not even encountered the term critical thinking until they get to university.
Or until they get to QAnon, right?
Yeah, or until they get to QAnon and conspiracy theories dressed up as critical thinking. Right, exactly.
Exactly. And conspiracy theory is dressed up as critical theory. And suddenly you have all these conspiracy theorists telling you that you don't know how to think critically.
Exactly. And so they use the exact same language of critical thinking to sell conspiracy theory to people. And that's so problematic, because if you had some critical thinking classes in elementary and middle school, you would know right away that you're being bought and sold by these people who are trying to control you. And so Americans don't like to be controlled classically, right? And that is why those kinds of modes of manipulation work pretty well, because they're turning that desire to not be controlled back upon you in order to control you. And so that's one thing we've got to do, is implement critical thinking in education and build out an information and media literacy. And it can't just be this one size fits all program that says, yes, there are certain universal things that we can teach kids in public schools, but we also need bespoke programs in specific places. So it means that states have to get involved. It means cities have to get involved and think about who lives in that city. What languages do they speak? What cultures do they represent? You can't just come up with a mode of teaching this stuff that is homogenous. It has to be heterogeneous depending upon the population it's being taught to. And that's a challenge, but it's not a challenge that's insurmountable in the United States because we have such a weird political system where we have state power and federal power. So we can use that state power to our benefit. It's just that the states have to be made to do it in such a way that does not result in leaving out large populations of the US public, specifically communities of color and diaspora communities and others. So education, policy is a huge thing, and policy is the most frustrating space for me, honestly. Like,
tell me why.
Same reason most Americans are probably really frustrated with it is there just seems to be no ability in Congress to actually pass bipartisan legislation, despite the fact that most Americans, the majority of Americans, want to see bipartisan legislation. They want to see people reaching across the aisle. And then tech is the last one, honestly. Like, maybe I'm shooting myself in the foot because I'm a tech politics researcher, but tech is important because we're talking about the tools that allow us to get the information that we have. So media technology. And media technology has to be altered in order to make the system better alongside these other two things and many others that we're not mentioning. But
altered, does it have to be altered or regulated? Altered
and regulated.
Yeah, right.
I think the current platforms that we have, regulation first, because there's very little of it right now, and then some altering. So people like Safia Noble and Virginia Eubanks and Zizi Papakarisi and many others have talked about the fact that technology has been designed, particularly social media and particularly search engines, in such a way that they prioritize algorithms and keeping people's eyes on the screen before they prioritize people's well-being, people's democratic rights, and people's human rights. And so one of the big things I talk about in the reality game is this idea, which I need to build out more, but which is, how do we design technology for human rights? How do we design social media for democracy? We have to start talking about these things in concrete terms. And human rights, the language of human rights is a language that's been built over the last, several decades, and centuries, and makes a lot of sense and actually can be regulated and dictated to these social media companies so that they're not actually violating people's essential human rights. And so social media companies do need to be redesigned. Like the current systems, Facebook and Twitter, these and YouTube and others, these patches and plugins and small scale changes and these ad hoc building the plane while the plane is being flown is not working.
Right.
In order for them to be functionally more beneficial for the most amount of people and for the benefit of society, democracy, human rights, all these sorts of things, equality, equity, which is even more important, they have to be redesigned. We need new social media systems. We need new modes of prioritizing content to people. And we need to think about the question of speech online and what it means.
I'd love to hear what you think about just the need to become people to each other again. I mean, I just wonder if you think about how we might facilitate that.
The interesting thing is, and this is based on some research done by a friend of mine, Doug Gilboa, and some of his colleagues. Doug is at Berkeley Haas School for Business. And some of the research he's done mirrors what we see in everyday life, which is something you've mentioned earlier in our conversation, which is that in everyday life, we're able to get along. Like, if we don't know someone's a Republican or a Democrat, we're able to chat with them, have a great conversation, even become friends. And it doesn't dictate or dominate our day-to-day interactions. We don't all walk around with Republican written over our head or Democrat written over our head. If we did, it would be hellacious. Doug has done some research that shows that if we were able to design social media in such a way that resulted in less partisan identification and less partisanship in the media and these systems, that people would actually be able to collaborate a hell of a lot better. And so he does these experiments around what's called collective intelligence. When him and his colleagues put in political affiliation, Republicans and Democrats were not able to work together to figure out whether or not something was true or false. I think they were looking at stuff on climate change. When he took away partisan affiliation, he was able to show that they were able to work together so well, and that Republicans and Democrats did better together than they did when they were only segmented into either Republicans or Democrats. And this has been published, I believe it was published in PNAS, or one of the best journals that's out there. And so people should check out Doug's research, because that's one of the areas that gives me hope.
Yeah.
Because it speaks to this idea that when it comes down to it, we can do what we need to do as long as we're not embroiled in an obsession with what your politics are.
Right. Right. And therefore being used, basically manipulated for profit.
Yeah. Yeah. And it permeates multiple dimensions of American society. It's not just as simple as like the old way that Facebook used to allow you to put like whether you're very liberal, very conservative, or something in between. It's also just that, our media systems function this way, and lots of other systems. And so Doug's research and other people who are working on these kinds of research projects, it has implications for how we design our information systems in a new way. Britton Heller, who's a friend and a former collaborator, she used to work at the Anti-Defamation League. I'm not sure where she is now, but she's a Yale-educated lawyer and a very good thinker on these topics, specifically on topics of harassment and disinformation on systems like virtual reality. And one of the things she said in a conversation we had was, she quoted The Art of War to me, which I thought was funny. But what she said was, in The Art of War, it says, we must build a golden bridge over which our enemies can retreat.
Right.
And the idea behind that, I think, is a really important one, because we think that just by fact checking someone, telling them they're wrong, or by re-educating them, that we can change their minds. And I think what this quote says is that we actually have to give them respect. We actually have to give them love and care and attention, the kind of attention that you're saying is missing from a lot of these people in the United States, in order to get them to see how they're being manipulated.
Right. To me, it's not as fruitful to think about it in terms of retreat or advance so much as just to think about like a path forward into the future.
Totally.
Right? Like, yeah, maybe screw that part of The Art of War. I'm sorry. I mean, it's a good quote, but like enough about advancing and retreating, enough of this war terminology,
Screw that. You're totally right.
Come on.
You need to write the next book, like The Art of Peace.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I love that point. And what I think is that it might be true that people have done pretty screwed up things or said pretty screwed up things, but we need to practice forgiveness, and we need to practice the ability to reconcile and treat each other with dignity. Because if we don't, we will continue to be able to be divided and conquered by the people who exist in power, rather than get them out of power and put people who actually have our benefit, our success in mind.
Do you ever get overwhelmed? Do you ever feel despair?
Yeah, I mean, I feel despair a lot. It's okay to feel sad, and it's okay to feel despair and to feel depressed about the way that things are. But it's important that we try to not lose hope. And so I'm not saying don't feel depressed, go do something else. I don't think that's useful at all.
Just don't give up, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Think about now. Think about what's possible. Think about what's what your current reality is. And for me, like that translates into practicing a lot of mindfulness and like reteaching my brain how to stop thinking about what if and think about more about what is. Because a lot of our what ifs are grounded in anxiety and a version of reality that may never happen. And how can we make it hopeful? How can we be curious about not only our current existence and the problems that we face, but also what's coming? How do we practice curiosity?
Thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been really fun.
All right, you guys, we did it. We made it to the end of our first weekly show. Here are my 3 main takeaways from my talk with Sam. Number 1, as suspected, the media really does play a part in our country's current divide. A big one. Yes, the right-wing media tends to play a lot faster and looser with the truth than the left, but Woolley says both sides are guilty. This is because American media outlets are owned by for-profit corporations, which means at the end of the day, their main focus is always going to be on making money. So they're always going to present the most spectacular stories they can find in a very high-drama way. And while some organizations are obviously willing to stretch the truth way farther than others, both sides do this. They focus on the scariest, most conflict-driven stories out there. And they present these stories in overly simplistic, polarizing ways. Ways that make us think in terms of us and them, and kind of force us to see our country as a war zone. So on one hand, we need the media. We need to know what's going on. On the other hand, we need to remember that the news is not really an accurate depiction of the world. It's just the most dramatic stuff, the scariest, wildest stuff. And unfortunately, that scary, wild stuff encourages us not to really see each other as humans, as individuals, as the strange and complicated and beautiful and tender and angry and sad and goofy and confused people we really are a lot of the time. Number 2, social media has taken this whole for-profit thing to a whole other level. Because the news is available 24/7, it's like living in a casino where they never turn the lights off. There's always some terrifying news story someone's posted on Facebook or Twitter. And because social media companies are still not properly regulated by the government, it's the Wild West out there. Yes, some sites have gotten more rigorous about blocking false content. But at the same time, you have states like Florida and Texas passing laws that prohibit this blocking, saying it violates people's right to free speech. Number 3, fixing this is going to be a big project. We need a radically improved public education system, one that teaches kids how to think critically about the media and social media. Because social media is addictive. And unfortunately, it's full of really exciting lies. It's designed that way right now, like a drug. And if that drug is not carefully regulated, it could break us. So to that end, I'm going to talk policy here for a second. Stay with me. We need policies that require social media companies to put people's health and sanity above all, above our desire for profit, even above our desire for free speech. Because our desire for free speech is not always good for us, and it's not always good for other people. Finally, we need these policies in place like yesterday. Because if Donald Trump doesn't end up in jail, he's got a serious shot at getting back into the White House in 2024. And we can't let that happen. In the meantime, I'll be here, trying not to freak out too much about our country, trying to focus on the awesome gift of being here with you all each week on the Control Variable, and getting to talk to you about this crazy world of ours. And when I get freaked out, which I'm sure I will again at some point, I'll retreat to Twin Peaks for a little while, catch my breath, and think about Donna, living the most beautiful dream and the most terrible nightmare, all at the same time. Thanks for joining me on the Control Variable. See you next time. The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein is the supervising producer. Rob Okendo and I are producers of the podcast. The technical producer and supervising editor is Derek Michaud of Shelby Rowe Productions. Sound editing is by Alex Aerosmith, and technical support is provided by Eric Totora Patu. Website creative direction by Randy Brasoff. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The Control Variable is managed by Sean Madison, and Megan Petta is fact checker, researcher, guest coordinator, and the person who keeps the Control Variable train on tracks every day. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.